Hello everybody. I'm missing you all so much, and I'm sure we are all missing one another. It's been more than 2 months since we had to close our churches for public worship, and many of us may well have thought that we would be back in our buildings by now. This, however, is clearly not the case. These months have been a time of great loss, of which this loss is, however, only a tiny part. The loss of life that we as communities throughout the world have suffered is a real tragedy for us all. It is a very poignant and personal tragedy for those who have been most deeply affected. It is these people, each one a human being with loved ones, relatives and friends, who are at the forefronts of our minds at present. Each person is much more than a statistic. Such insight is at the heart of what it is to remember and to live the story of Jesus too. The death and resurrection of this one embodies all our deaths. The death of anyone is a death that we remember as we attempt to follow Christ, and it affects us all. Placing their life and death, as well as our own human glory, fragility and mortality, into the presence of his death and resurrection, leads us to pray that we, along with all who have died and all living things, may come to that new heaven and new earth in which death is fully eclipsed by love. We've now come to a stage where both the government and the Church of England are beginning to plan for how we can reopen our buildings and return to public worship. All of this must be done slowly and with great caution, in order that we can minimise the risks that are still very much present for all of us. Nothing is as yet decided, and these are tentative preparations at present. The government and the Church's approach is quite rightly only to loosen restrictions if evidence shows that COVID-19 is not spreading. This means that it is highly likely that our churches will remain closed for public worship until at least the beginning of July. However, it may be an even longer wait. At this point, if permission is given, it may then be possible to have restricted services, but they will have to be controlled in numbers, with physical distancing in place and with a protocol for thorough cleaning and sanitisation of the building after each service. It's also highly likely that singing and refreshments will not be allowed. It will also probably not be possible to host the kids' club at the rectory. My guess is that the first step will see the churches unlocked and available for personal prayer. Nothing, as I say, has yet been decided. And hanging over all this is the possibility that in the winter, if the NHS looks like it is being overwhelmed with COVID-19 and the usual seasonal increase in demand, we might well be called back into lockdown. My hope is that as the summer proceeds, restrictions will gradually be lifted. However, it will be a very long time indeed before Sunday worship is restored to anything like it was before our present crisis emerged. That means that we will need to plan for an extended time of disruption to our common life. Rather than waiting for things to return quickly to how they were before, we ought to turn our minds rather to how we are going to adjust and adapt to the new normal of the situation in which we find ourselves. We've already begun to rise to these challenges by recording and emailing worship, recording and emailing thoughts for the day, preparing worship and study material for our church schools and home learners. We may well have to consider holding PCC meetings to discuss essential matters on Zoom or similar. My hope is that you still feel connected to our common life in some way with all that we have put in place, and that you keenly experience our spiritual communion with one another as the body of Christ and with God through Christ himself. The people who most concern me are those who are not online. My hope and prayer is that the informal friendship links between you all will ensure that you contact these members of the church family by telephone or even by an old-fashioned letter or card. So please make contact with anyone you know who might be missing their church family. All of this is a real challenge and learning experience for all of us. I am enormously grateful to Leslie and Carrie for their amazing support. I am particularly sorry that Carrie was confined to the vicarage just a few days after joining us. Clergy are usually allowed to roam freely in the community for a longer period than this. You are daily in our prayers, and we long for the day when we are able to meet together again and worship in our beautiful churches.